All right, so all that are here, welcome. And I guess we'll give it a start with all the objections that we seem to have with the Bible. Long about the 17th century, things were going pretty well. The Bible was pretty much understood and believed. But then long about the end of the 17th and early 1800s, started to be some skepticism develop. German textual criticism, historical criticism, just every criticism they could think to make. But let me read a couple of them that I got in from a book. So these, some of the objections centered on the fact that the dogmatic and ethical objections: could Moses have authored such an offensive material as stories of Noah's drunkenness, Abraham's lies, the polygamy of the patriarchs, his own murdering of an Egyptian, extolling his meekness, dating objections: did Moses write the many pieces of the Pentateuch which reflect a later date than his own lifetime, including his own obituary in Deuteronomy 34, 5 through 12. So those are the objections. Now, I think those are kind of weak personally. I mean, obviously somebody else wrote the obituary. That's to be expected. That's pretty obvious. Moses is not going to write his own obituary. But other than that, I think that's a reach for them to start trying to say the rest of the story now, because they don't think that Moses should have been writing derogatory stuff. Now, if you look at some of the other ancient writings of other cultures, they really don't do much of that. They don't be writing about the king doing this or that wrong, or they don't talking anymore. But the Bible's not like that. The Bible talks about truth, and we know that. We know that it talks about truth.
Well, that's one of the things that is pointed out in Cold Case Christianity, that the Bible contains stories that don't present the heroes in a great light.
Yeah.
They present them as fallible. They present them as having problems, and that's, as you said, unusual in literature to do that. Usually these are heroes, and they gloss over their failures and their shortcomings. But when you're telling a truthful story, you're going to highlight those. Yep. This person accomplished this despite having these issues.
Mm-hmm. And all of them have issues. And if you were to think about it very closely, which that's what I don't think they do. They want to try to find problems with it. But when you, like Dirk said, when you're really actually reading about a story, it's not going to all be high points. Mm-hmm. There are going to be some low points where, Moses murdered an Egyptian. He's telling about Abraham telling lies, which I think we all do. Has anybody here not told lie before?
That's a lie.
That's a lie.
Today yet.
Not yet today.
I haven't since 10 o'clock.
So, it seems to me that that's kind of a reach. That's what was going on. They're saying that Moses couldn't have written all this stuff, and actually it was written by people afterwards that were trying to piece it together. Now, the reason for that, why are they trying to make it so that later in the dates they're trying to piece it together? That's something that we'll cover. One of the finds they made makes it very unlikely that they pieced this together 300 or 400 years after the fact, because of a very minor official that came up that they mentioned, and they turned out that Archaeology mentions it as well. Go get to that. Okay. But that's some of their objections. And what Moses wrote was real stuff. The prophets like Hosea, for example, what he was told to do. You wouldn't expect God to have Hosea do that, but what was he trying to get across, right? And God allowing his people's place to be destroyed, completely destroyed. Why would he do something like that? That's their objections. Well, why are they saying all this stuff if this is supposed to be God's chosen people? Well, as we know, God brought him to the woodshed sometimes.
Well, weren't they in the desert, and he went to Moses and said, I'm just going to wipe them out and start over again with you.
Yep.
And so God did discipline them several times. That's why they had to wander around 40 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In some place that takes 6 days to walk across.
Yeah, exactly. And then one of the other ones, which was of particular interest to me, And they question whether Adam and Eve were actually the first humans. Somebody named Leperrier, I guess. You know, as a result of all this, the Bible came to be treated like any other book, subjected to canons of criticism, as the Pentateuch was written later, developing history. The work of multiple authors rather than just Moses was their complaint. I'd like to address the Adam and Eve thing. We were talking about that earlier. But Adam and Eve, it seems to me that if you actually want to know that how humans came to be, well, we're all related to somebody, right? My parents brought me around. Your parents all brought you around. Your grandparents brought them around. And so on backwards in time, right? The further you go backwards in time, the less people you're going to have, right? There's quite a few studies been done that, based on the population, we got 8 billion people on the planet now, and the first time we reached 1 billion was in 1810. So it grew 7 billion people in only a couple hundred years. So you keep going backwards with that count at the standard 3.2% increase each year. You come to the point where we're all related to somebody who lived somewhere between 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. And as you go backwards in time, you just keep eliminating more and more people till you get down to the first two. And talk about this for a second, this stuff. Evolution has a real problem with that, because the first two had to have some things happen. First of all, they had to appear at the same time. If they appeared 70 or 80 years apart, there's not going to be any other people. They had to appear at the same time, in the same place, with the same basic instructions included. Now the question is,
and as the Bible says, male and female he created.
Male and female, exactly. At the same time, at the same place, because that's what Genesis 2 talks about. Mm-hmm. Genesis 2 switches from the overall general description of how things were created to the point where he's now going to be starting to talk about humans, because that is where the book goes, is humans. So he says that, okay, I made a Garden of Eden, and I put the male and the female in there at that time. So my question, your question should be, when you come to that conclusion, is, okay, well, these two, first of all, they have a belly button, but these two, where did they get their DNA from? The rest of us all got it from our parents, right? Everybody got it from the parents. Those two didn't have parents. Where did they get their DNA from? That seems like something that you should be listening to, but when you're only looking for errors in the Bible, maybe that doesn't come about. And then another one of their objections: would a single author have told the same story more than once? Variations of or deviations from the accounts, like Genesis 1 and then Genesis 2. If you read those two, you know, they try to make criticisms out of it, because it seems like there's two different creation events. Tell me what you think about that.
Well, I think there's only one creation event. But anytime you retell a story, you do tailor some of it to your audience. Mm-hmm. You do have to, I don't want to say get rid of some facts or interject other facts, but there may be questions that arose, that somebody said, what about this? And then, okay, this is how it happened in creation. Mm-hmm. You know, so a retelling of a story doesn't mean that the story is wrong. It just means it's being retold.
Retold with maybe a different emphasis.
Different emphasis on different parts. Yeah. Answering different questions that may have arose. Just to, you know, if they're quizzing them and saying, you know, how long did this part take? What had happened here? And so on. And so they're just answering some of the questions that arose, I think. Yeah. And just telling the story in a more full or way to directly address the people that are asking this.
If you read the text closely, you can see that God is doing just exactly that. Saying, okay, this is how I did. I rested on the seventh day, and then I took the humans that I created and I put them over here. Now I'm going to tell you a story about this place. Mm-hmm. Eden's a different place than the complete creation of the universe. It's only listed for here on earth. It's a particular place on earth that he put them at. Where that is, I don't know. There's some interesting thought patterns behind all that.
Well, because if they're explaining something and they're in the Garden of Eden and it's this area only, this is where you gotta have to be. Mm-hmm. And you know, if you have any kids, they're gonna ask, What's over there?
Mm-hmm.
What's happened here? What's beyond this? And so that's going to be an explanation of how things occur.
Yeah. And Eden, if they weren't going to die, then there's going to be some special things going on there that didn't happen afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
Like entropy, for example.
Yeah.
If they're not going to die and nobody's going to die and nothing to deteriorate, then the second law of thermodynamics didn't exist at that point.
Yeah.
Because there's no entropy. Fortunately, it didn't last very long because they messed up. But at that point, it seems like that's logical to assume that there isn't any deterioration going on like what's going on now. With every day we get older, something else doesn't start working quite as well as it used to.
Is that what that is? Gravity increases as you get older. That's what I keep saying.
Unfortunately, that's very true. And then there also have some complaints in regards to why is Moses talking more about different aspects of the creation, such as Genesis chapter 12, it's talking about where he went into the land. Genesis chapter 20 talks about him coming back out of the land. But they're also talking about the fact that they complain about the fact that Moses mentions earlier times in his life, such as Genesis 14, 36, Exodus 6. It's just, again, they're trying to find errors. Seems to me like if you're having a certain situation come up, maybe you've seen that situation come up before, and you mention it again, like he mentions in, let's look up Genesis, like for example, Genesis 6, 26 and 27. Just
Okay, I got to go to my magic phone here.
Magic phone, yeah.
Genesis 6.
26 and 27.
And your phone's going there too?
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's Genesis, Exodus.
Exodus?
6.
Yeah, I was going to say, Genesis doesn't have that many in it.
26 and 27.
26
Okay. You there?
and 27. These are the Aaron and Moses to whom the Lord said, bring out the people of Israel from the land of Egypt by their hosts. It was they who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, about bringing out the people of Israel from Egypt, this Moses and this Aaron.
So he's just reflecting on the fact of what's happened to him in the past. And of course, they want to complain about that as well.
Well, one of the things too, and I've heard this a while ago, one of the things that we lose so much since Gutenberg invented the printing press, which was one of the greatest inventions ever, but we lose oral tradition. When you're telling a story, how do you tell the story? And when they're telling the story, the reason that they could keep it so well is because they knew it so well, and the kids knew it so well. Everybody knew it well. And so if they started to deviate, they go, no. Last time you said it like this, because they knew it.
Yeah.
And so he's going to be saying this, and telling it as a story. You're telling it as a story, Aaron and Moses went in, even if Moses is saying that.
Mm-hmm.
It's an oral tradition method.
Yeah.
So that the next generation will remember that exactly as that and be able to say that.
Big events.
Yes.
The old complaint about the oral tradition is that, if I pass it to you, something minor, you pass it to my wife, she passes it to Linda, then to Mark.
Oh, the game of
and
telephone.
so on, yeah. But those are minor events. When you have something happen like smoke coming out of the top of a mountain, a loud voice coming from the clouds, and Moses coming back with a bright, shiny face, those are not stuff people want. Someone walking on water to your boat, those are not going to be something you forget. Yeah. Those are etched in your memory. When events like that happen, you can recall even 20 or 25 years after the fact.
Well, and especially if you're with other people that had that same event, you're going to be telling, they'll say, well, wait, this happened at that point too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so you're going to be able to self-correct everything. Like even if you're doing the game of telephone, if you're saying it out loud, by the time it gets to the fourth person, the other two people that were before them are going to say, no, that's not right. Yeah. This is what's right.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's part of the oral tradition. That's part of why they included their names like this.
And the fact-checking was
everybody hearing it.
Mm-hmm. And the fact that you have amazing events, what you had 3 days ago for lunch, you might not be able to remember that. But like I said, if somebody walks on water to your boat, that's probably not something you're going to forget very soon.
Yeah.
So those problems about the fact that things may have been oral at some point, it depends on what they are. That's a big depend.
Yes.
So let me see if there's any more objections here, if I can get the screen back on. Give me a minute here. Okay, it's going to be difficult. All right.
You have entered the incorrect password.
So, and then they're also talking about, and this is an interesting idea that I thought was really. So they're complaining about the fact that the creation and flood stories of Genesis, for example, are understood to have emerged from ancient New Eastern cultures, in which Israel found themselves, where such stories were generated, shaped, eventually making their way into Israel's own writing. They're complaining about the fact that all these things, like, for example, the Hammurabi, that seems to predate Moses writing about the flood. So is that really a problem, though? I personally think that's a stretch. If Moses is writing about history, which he was, he didn't write, and when he's writing Genesis, he's writing about history. He didn't exist at that point. He existed quite a bit later. But if he's actually writing a historical document that somebody dictated to him, personally, I think we all think God dictated to him. But if he's writing about a historical event, then would you expect to see other societies writing about a global event such as a flood? Is that a deterrence to the story, or is that actually something that it makes it so it's more believable?
I think it just confirms it, because if you have other cultures that are covering the same story, maybe not the same exact wording, but they're covering it and said, yes, there's a great flood, and how many did cultures have that in their history?
Everybody except Japan.
Yeah, everybody except
Japan's
Japan
the only one that doesn't have
has that.
Yeah.
And I've been to Japan, and I can understand why they don't think there is a great flood. Because it rains so much, they just think that it's normal. So, but everybody has that, and so why would you say, well, they borrow from this, they borrow from this? Why wasn't it just an event that occurred throughout the world that they all recorded?
And God didn't just speak to Moses.
Oh no,
he spoke to Abraham. He spoke to Adam and Eve. He spoke to Enoch. He spoke to Noah
directly, and he's speaking to humanity through his creation.
Yeah. So when I get objections like that, I say, well, why would you think that God just spoke to Moses? He's the creator of all things. He spoke to his people all along. So the fact that there are similar stories from everybody down to the Sumerians even talk about a flood. They talk about other things that the Bible talks about as well. The fact that the historical events coincide, you'll hear atheists talk about that and try to say it's an objection, but I think it's exactly the opposite, what you would expect to see. Yeah, that's the same stuff, but all right. So you wanna fill us in on some of Nineveh?
Nineveh.
Yes, and some of the scripture that goes along with it.
All right. So what do we have for Nineveh?
I think it's Isaiah 36.
Because I didn't get those notes anyway.
Yeah. I think it's Isaiah 36 is where it talks about.
In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. So Sennacherib was a Assyrian king, and the capital of Assyria was Nineveh. So what's a famous story about Nineveh? What does that involve? Some guy and goes fishing. It doesn't make it.
Yeah. Yep.
I think one of the most interesting things about the Nineveh story in Jonah is that Jonah didn't want to be there. And so his message to the people of Nineveh walking around is, 30 days and you're going to be dead. Thank you very much. Goodbye. That's what he's saying. He's not elaborating on it. He's not saying anything else on it. But that word came at the exact time that God had planned for it to be there.
Planned for it to be there and had opened the eyes of the people of Nineveh as well.
Yeah.
Like Jay had said, they had a couple of big battles that they maybe didn't win.
Mm-hmm.
There was some plagues that came along, all during the time when Jonah was going to be showing up, and then they had the eclipse.
Yeah.
The eclipse in ancient societies, that was a very fearful thing. You had no idea why it was the sun just went black, and it was actually a complete eclipse over Nineveh. I think it was in 763 BC. They tracked that down, but God can prepare things. It seems to me that God can prepare people with natural events.
I think he can, and part of that too, I think, is in his preparation, he's preparing things not for just then, but for now, throughout history, and that's why we have some of the things. We have the archaeological evidence that tells us this. Hezekiah says this prayer, and the king of Assyria was Sennacherib. He was the one that was kind of in charge of all this. Built, as kings do. I want to be king. I want to build a bigger palace than somebody else. So builds a big palace. He takes a bunch of fortified cities. Lachish is one of them, another fortified cities. And then Hezekiah makes this prayer. But it seems that Hezekiah was praying somewhere else. Not from Jerusalem.
From Lachish.
From Lachish. I pronounce that Lachish.
Lachish?
But it's Lachish. Wouldn't. Yeah. Potato.
Yeah.
So what is interesting though is that they found the walls of Sennacherib's palace. Because there's cuneiform inscriptions on it saying this is Sennacherib's palace. That was there. Now, he conquered, I'm going to say Lachish again, so what?
Lachish?
Lachish. Lachish sounds like dinner though, or something.
Sounds like something you would eat for dinner, yeah.
So. But they found this, and they know that it wasn't Jerusalem that was taken. They know it had to be this because Jerusalem is still standing there, and they found the walls, and there's cuneiforms in there. And if it had been Jerusalem that had been conquered, they would have had notes on Jerusalem being conquered. They would have had inscriptions. They would have had pictures of Jerusalem being conquered.
And the booty.
And the booty from there, but they didn't. And so they know that this was not Jerusalem that was conquered by Assyria. Now, in the book Unearthing the Bible, it notes that the ruins of Lachish correspond with the depiction of the Nineveh reliefs. So they're saying that this is here, and it's the same thing that happens here. That that what we've uncovered corresponds with the stories.
Yeah.
In it. Now, there's this thing called a Taylor prism. You know what a prism is?
I've got pictures.
It's not the thing we shine lights through now.
I've got a picture of it.
It's a three-sided object. Three-sided
Something
tube,
like these.
basically.
You guys can, if you can see that still, but it's just a rock that has got cuneiform on it. And they didn't know how to do the cuneiform for quite some time, but language experts finally figured it out.
Rosetta Stone.
Rosetta Stone helped a lot, yeah.
But that also talks about Nineveh and the fall and what happened in Nineveh. So it describes these things. And so historically, they were saying, well, how come they didn't conquer Jerusalem? They must have conquered Jerusalem because they were the most powerful army. They couldn't be stopped. Even though Hezekiah is saying, don't rely on Egypt for your help. You're not going to get it. But they did. They were stopped.
And some of the excuses, I read some of the excuses. Some of the excuses from secular historians were that mice ate the bowstrings of the Assyrian army. That's the reason why they didn't take Jerusalem. I mean, come on, give me a break. You can't come with any better than that.
And that's why all those guys shot each other with bad bowstrings?
Yeah.
Or they stab each other with the arrows in the middle of the night.
So, and if you're really thinking about that, now, Jerusalem had the most money. They were the biggest city. They had all this gold that was in the temple. They wanted that city really bad. So why in the world did they not take it? That's what you can start thinking about. Why did they take it? They took everything else. Yeah. It wasn't like Jerusalem was that much better fortified.
Rich city at the time.
Very rich city, but it wasn't any better fortified than Lachish was. Lachish.
Yeah, Lachish.
But they didn't take it.
I got you saying it now.
You do. But they didn't take it. And a historian, if they were actually trying to critically think about why they didn't take it, they might think, okay, they had all the army there. They actually had two armies there. Sennacherib sent one first.
Mm-hmm.
They tried to take it, and then Sennacherib showed up as well. So they had plenty of armies to take it. Why not? Now, I mean, when you institute something that's supernatural, then automatically everybody throws their hands up and says, hold on a second, that's supernatural. What do you talk about, angels?
Yeah.
You give me a reason why they didn't take Jerusalem.
Yeah,
And that's what I say to atheists. Why you give me a reason why they didn't take it?
2 armies there, and mice eating their bowstrings if they manage to just beat each other up. And
Yeah. So it's just, to me, it's just another description of the fact that we can rely on the Bible. When it talks about a story, you can rely on it. Archaeology now is bringing it up where, like I said earlier, in the early 1800s, they started thinking that none of this stuff was true. The Bible may have some good moral stories to it, but all the stuff that they had in there was all just produced around the moral story. It really didn't happen. But as archaeology came around, and archaeology, they've been doing it for a long time, but the scientific part of archaeology where they're actually trying to date things, that's only been around maybe a couple hundred years.
Mm-hmm.
Until the scientific part of it, yeah. And then it started coming around to the fact that they were finding things like the Taylor prism, like the Nebuchadnezzar stele, like the Sarkikian tablet, if that's how you pronounce that. This is a really interesting one, because this is one that most archaeologists find this to be an astounding find. Because as you read the book of Daniel, it's talking about some higher officials, okay? The ones that everybody hears about, Nebuchadnezzar, obviously that's all over text throughout history. So if somebody was writing this late, is my point, if somebody's writing this late, like they accused Daniel of doing, the book of Daniel is accused to be written sometimes in the 200s instead of the 500s. But when you come across a minor figure, and it's evidenced by the fact that the Babylonian writings about this minor figure, he's the eunuch that Daniel talks about. Daniel talks about it in his book. It's a minor official. There's no mention of it throughout history. So if somebody's writing this late about that time, how could they get this minor official right when he's hardly ever mentioned? But they did find his name. They finally found his name. I think it's in the 1800s. They found this guy's name. The same eunuch that Daniel mentioned is mentioned on a stele, on this tablet, Neo-Sarkikian tablet, and it's a minor official. Most archaeologists find this to be astounding stuff. This means that Daniel was at the place where he was writing about, otherwise there was no reason why he would know about this official.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, how many of you know who the Assistant Secretary of State is of the state of California? Okay, nobody here. So it's that kind of a thing, but even lower down the totem pole on that this minor official exists, and
the
so nobody would write it down. You might write down Newsom's name on something, but you wouldn't write down,
No cussing, please.
Joe. Yeah, sorry. Joe Manchurian or whatever, you wouldn't write his name down because he's such a minor official. It doesn't make any sense to include that in the story. But it's included in Daniel's story, and then there's evidence here that it was written on this stele because he had to.
But he was an important official to Daniel.
Yes.
Because that's the one that Daniel dealt with. He was the one that gave Daniel his meals. He was the one that Daniel talked into giving him only vegetables instead of the rest of the meals. This is important to Daniel. So when they start talking about Daniel writing this late, why would he know about this official if he's making this story up? And the fact that the other parts are that Daniel's predicting about the Egyptian Empire, the Medo-Persians, the Babylonians, even after that, the Romans, the Greeks. He's talking about all those civilizations. Now, they argue about that. They say, how could Daniel possibly know that? Because, of course, they exclude God from this equation. But they're saying, well, that all had to be written late, because how could Daniel know about things that are coming in the future? But when I first started reading about all this stuff, all the archaeology and all the apologetic stuff, I thought, okay, well, how do we know that for sure? And actually, I was on a trip, Greg Laurie was talking about it. He said, well, those things are important, But more important is the fact that Daniel predicted when Jesus was coming to the
Yeah, that's a fascinating thing too.
That's a fascinating thing, because now you're not talking about something that happened pre Dead Sea Scrolls. This is something that happened after the Dead Sea Scrolls. We know for sure Daniel was a book that was written in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They found it. And so is Isaiah. So now you've got to explain, okay, well, they were also predicting about this coming Messiah, exactly what he would do, the over 300 different things that prophesied of him doing, and he did all of them. So now, if you want to complain about Daniel being written in 200 or so BC or 350 BC, that's fine. How's he getting Jesus right? How's he getting Messiah to show up on an exact day? April 9th, 32 AD is the one that most thinks it is. But Daniel prophesied of the 62 plus the 69 weeks. That comes out to be 173,880 days per Richard.
Well, here's something that occurs to me on that. If somebody decided to backdate that when they were writing the Gospels and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put this way back in the book of Daniel. Why would they even think to do that? Mm-hmm. Why would they even think we need to write this into Daniel to predict when the Messiah was going to be here? Why couldn't they say, he rode into Jerusalem, people praised him as the Messiah, and he was crucified? Why do they have to go and backdate that? Mm-hmm. It doesn't really make any sense to do that. But when Daniel's saying it, he is saying the Messiah is going to come on this day. He's going to go through Jerusalem on this day, ride in Jerusalem on this day. And so he's making a prophecy, but to backdate it wouldn't make wouldn't give you any kind of a why think about it, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Exactly.
So that's another thing that I think is important for us to remember, is that archaeology backs up our position. It doesn't weaken our position, it backs it up. Even if you try to take some of the stuff they complain about, the empires that Daniel predicted. The other thing is Daniel's I think it says Daniel's Aramaic, was an Aramaic they actually used at the time. It wasn't Aramaic that they used in 100 or 200 BC. They actually used that style of Aramaic back in 500 BC. That's another one of the criticisms that I've seen happen in some of the answers to it. So we can count on the fact that the Bible's accurate, and we can challenge people that say it's not. So one of the other the fact about this the fact about this eunuch, it's also in Jeremiah 39:3. I'll read that part. The 9th year of Zedekiah, king of Judah, in the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army came against Jerusalem and besieged it. I'm sorry, that's not about the eunuch. It's just talking about the fact that that Jeremiah is talking about when Nebuchadnezzar came to siege Jerusalem and besiege it. And Zedekiah, in the 4th month, on the 9th day of the month, the city was penetrated. Then all the princes and kings of Babylon came in and sat in the middle gate. And all these names, actually, he is mentioned here. Negal-Sharzarian, Samgar-Nebo. I'm not going to try these names.
What was that again?
Yeah, I'm not going to try these names because they're difficult. But again, that same guy, this Nebo-Sarsekian, the eunuch, is mentioned also in Jeremiah. Yeah, so he's mentioned there as well. And then there's also Nebuchadnezzar's palace. There's a documents as far as the digs on that. I'll leave this with you guys so you can see that.
What about this thing when Daniel made third ruler of Babylon?
Yeah, and Belshazzar.
What does that deal with? I mean, I know he was appointed third ruler for his interpretation of dreams. But why is that a question?
There was a stele found of that as too. It's called the Nabon. I don't know why they don't make these names simple, but they don't. Nabonidus cylinder, and it speaks about the fact that Belteshazzar actually existed. Up until this point, people thought this is another nefarious figure, somebody that never existed, because they didn't find his name anywhere other than
More
the Bible.
composite of people.
Yeah, in the Bible it's mentioned, but they said, well, that's just the Bible. You know, it tells all kinds of stories. Well, they dug up the cylinder, and it has Belshazzar's name on it. And it's actually, the reason why it has his name on it is because the real king, Nabonidus, yeah, that guy. This is Belshazzar's father. And the thing they found is a prayer from Nabonidus praying for not only his trip that he was leaving on, the fact that he'll have a safe journey, but he's also praying for his son, Belshazzar. And it also talks about the fact that the invasion that happened was an invasion, as Daniel records it, there was no battle involved. And come to find out, there wasn't a battle involved because there happened to be a festival, and this Nabonidus cylinder talks about this. In fact, how they got in, the fact that there was no battle going on, and when they did get in, most of the soldiers were drunk because they were partying. That's what this cylinder talks about. Exactly what Daniel talks about, because he said that all the guys were partying, they were drinking out of the cups they weren't supposed to be drinking out of. God said, "You're in trouble, guys." The handwriting on the wall, the famous phrase that we get, "You guys are in trouble." And this cylinder talks about the fact that Belshazzar was killed, and Babylon was invaded without any type of battle. And in the English Museum now, there's a document showing the way they did it. They diverted the water so they could come in under the river where that was their protection. They had water flowing in. It was a big enough river where they couldn't get people to cross it. But they diverted the water so the water was low. They came in, there was a festival going on, they killed Belshazzar, and there was not much of a battle because the soldiers that were supposed to be protecting were all drunk from the festival. That's all documented in Daniel, but it's also documented in history as well with this cylinder that they found, the Nabonidus, the guy's cylinder.
Nabonidus.
Nabonidus, yeah, okay.
That's probably wrong too, but I'll just.
So yeah, that was another part of the Bible that is backed up by archaeology. We're just running through those just to show that the fact that it's reliable.
What's interesting, I think, is that they've had in the last 50 years, really, or 60 years, they've discovered so much of this stuff, and a lot of that is, I think, due to the change in how they're looking at archaeology. They're not looking at stuff going, "Oh, this is just a part of a piece of pottery, throw it away."
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're trying to save all that, and they can put together some more of this information. And how much that information just actually goes to support what the Bible is saying is incredible in this. Because as you said, you know, before it was, "Oh no, it couldn't be, this couldn't happen." And that's because it had been handed down for so many generations that they know this has to be just a made up story,
Mm-hmm.
you know, not the truth.
And they started wanting to say, well, it's just written in the book, but is the book really accurate? Whereas, you know,
Yes.
in the past, the book was considered to be a document of history. But then it started coming around to the point where, well, how can we prove that? Okay, that's
Yeah.
fine. And that's when archaeology actually started to come around, in that it became a scientific discipline rather than just, you happen to be digging up
Or the
something.
guy's
and
digging
finding
up
it.
something
Right.
and selling it online.
Yeah. And once they started doing that, like has been said, I'm sure you guys have heard the fact that there hasn't been an archaeological find that's ever been found that disputes what the Bible says. And that is a fact.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going through those right now over the fact that the real evidence that you see you dig out of the ground, it shows that Bible is telling accurate stories. Now, is that telling us that the salvation story, you know, the fact that Jesus died on the cross for our sins, can you have an archaeological find of that? You're not going to find that. But seems to me what it does say is if the Bible is describing all these minor details, such as this eunuch that Daniel happened to come across, describing all these minor details, then it's all the way back to all the way back to Mount Sinai. We've found all the archaeology lines up. If the Bible's telling us the accurate stories of the minor stuff, it's not really the Bible's intention to tell us a history story about, you know, where Mount Sinai is. The Bible's intention is to tell God's giving us his message so that we can understand it and we can act on it. That's what the Bible's real message is. And when you realize that the minor details of the Bible are accurate, then why would they be telling stories about what it's really about? What it's really about is our salvation, so we can have eternal life with God. And when we realize that the Bible is a written document that backs up history, it's really strengthened my faith when I started reading about that. It made me think, okay, this isn't just some book saying this. This is stuff that they've really made an accurate attempt to make sure that we understand what has happened in the past, how God has intervened in Israel in particular. That gives me help too. Gives me help the fact that God stuck with Israel no matter what, stuck with Jacob of all people no matter what. Jacob with all of his stories, all of his lies, all his tricking people, but God still stuck with him. That gives me courage. That gives me the fact that God's going to stick with me too. When I goof up, when I do stuff I'm not supposed to do, and all the rest of it, God still wants to hang with me. And Jacob's and Jacob and Israel overall. I mean,
Yes.
God sent Hosea, what he had to do just to try to get the Jewish people to realize that they were
all the
deserting
prophets,
him.
Jeremiah, Ezekiel, all the things they went through.
Mm-hmm.
Just was Jeremiah the weeping prophet that laid on his side in a hole,
Yeah.
naked for a year.
Yeah.
And God said, okay, you can turn over now.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's what they went through
Mhm.
to show the people the word of God.
Yeah.
And the suffering, I'm going, well, thank you. I don't have to lay in a hole naked for a year,
Or
But one of the things I wanted to ask you about, in your opinion on this, is when they started this departure from the Bible, saying, okay, well, we don't think these stories are true. We think they're cobbled together, made up. About what was occurring at that time that brought that about, that they were saying, okay, this can't be true in the Bible, what they're saying. What was happening in the world at the time?
well, that was the time of the Enlightenment as well. That's when that stuff was going on. But we were also getting people like Nietzsche, Hume, Marx, Kant. They're all atheists that were telling the story. They're trying to get it so the fact that this God is a mythical creature, we don't really need him. Science we don't need God to be involved here. We don't need that anymore. And especially, I personally think it's the morals. I think all those four guys, they didn't like the morals that the Bible dictated, and that's the reason why they didn't want it to be true. There wasn't a studied reason why it wasn't true. It wasn't true because they didn't want to be accountable for their actions. When you read about Marx in particular, all the rest of the guys are goofy as well. You read about Marx in particular, Karl Marx. That guy was nothing but a bum. He wouldn't work to save his family. He kept borrowing money from his parents. They finally gave it to the point where you either go out and get a job. We're not giving you any more money. He was a slob. He didn't bathe. He was just a character that, when you read about him and his objection to God, you can see that his objection to God was because he wanted to live his life the way he wanted to live it. And my personal thought is, and I say this regularly when I talk to atheists, I talk to them about, proof, this and that. This is the reason why I think the Bible is true. And they, come up with their objections. And they say, look, you're not looking for an answer. You're not looking for an answer because you don't want to be accountable for your actions. Hey, look, I don't want to be accountable for some of my actions either, but I know I am. And I know God has forgiven me for it. And I think that's important to let people know that even if they've messed up, and obviously if you're around trying to tell people God doesn't exist, God's not happy about that, but he can forgive you. So,
Well, yeah. So these guys come along and they have to take God out of the equation so they can justify what they're doing. In order to do that, they have to disprove in their minds or that what's in this, and so they
At least
start
try to
making up
disprove
stuff.
it, yeah.
And I think as we go along, we're finding out more and more and more the truths that exist in there. Archaeology supporting everything that happens, in the Old Testament and a lot of the New Testament. Logic that we have, as in Cold Case Christianity talks about, supports the story of Christ.
yeah.
And so I think that's one of the things we need to have is important, because we're still being attacked in the world.
Yeah.
That this is not true. It's just made up, or it was borrowed from this religion or that religion or that.
Christianity and Judaism is just some version of
Yeah.
Sumerian
Yeah.
stuff. And
So that's why it's important to not only study to defend our faith, but also for our own salvation, to understand that there's ample evidence for this
Exactly.
throughout history, that this is true, and that God has forgiven our sins, and that there is redemption, and that we are accountable for what we do.
yeah. And he wants us to give out the message. And when I first started thinking about doing, the idea of talking to atheists or agnostics, whoever, there was a particular quote in Revelation that kind of made me think, okay, well, maybe this is a good route. When Jesus is talking about Laodicea, the last church, he said, if you were hot or you were cold, then I could deal with both of those. But the fact that you're lukewarm, I'm going to spit you out of my mouth. Now, Christians, and me personally, I think evangelicals are hot. They want people to understand the Bible. They want people to understand the message behind it, the fact that it's accurate. So they're hot, and I think that's what God was talking about. He was talking about Philadelphia, because Philadelphia really loved God, and God didn't have any criticism of Philadelphia. When he got to Laodicea, he said, you know what? You guys are lukewarm. You don't really believe what I'm telling you. All you think about is making money, and Laodicea was a very successful sinner. But he was talking about them as being middle of the road. But he also talked about the cold part. And if you get any more cold than atheists are, then I don't know. But God said he's okay with the hot, and he's okay with the cold. He's worried about the ones that are in the middle, that really don't believe what they think. Maybe you call that agnostics. I don't know.
Well, I don't know.
But that encouraged me that that you could actually talk to atheists about God, and God's going to be involved in it.
Well, I think there's a lot of churches in the world that are lukewarm. They're just going with the flow right now. They're flying the rainbow flags and having LGBTQ plus alphabet soup people in their pulpit. And I think that that's where some of the lukewarmness gets us, is down that road. They understand who God is, and they have a passing knowledge of Christ, but they don't want to live by the teachings. They again are like the philosophers that brought us down this road, saying, I'm not responsible for my actions. I don't want to be responsible for my actions, so therefore I have to throw out all these parts of the Bible, and now I got to make up something to fill in the holes.
And I left out not the philosopher, but the psychologist. What's his name? Famous atheist philosopher. I'm trying to think of his name. Not philosopher, but psychologist.
Carl Jung, that one, or the?
It was the one that his dad was the one who caused all his problems, blaming it on your parents. I brought it.
Freud and
Freud, yeah, Freud. Freud was another one that was trying to run down the same road. He was trying to blame it on everybody else instead of taking knowledge for what he's doing.
Yeah.
And there was a supposed debate. It didn't really debate, but they took what Freud was saying and compared it to what C.S. Lewis was saying about the same subject. There's a book out with that intent to it, and they take Freud's ideas and they compare them with C.S. Lewis's ideas. And as you guys can probably guess, C.S. Lewis' ideas are far superior to what Freud was. But for years and years, Freud was considered to be the father of psychology, and his answers to everything were considered to be the answers. And of course, his philosophy was atheistic. But when they compared it with C.S. Lewis, like I said, C.S. Lewis came out as shining example. So where do we go from there?
We talked a little about the Messiah's appearance. That the prophecy in Daniel of Jesus, the Christ, entering Jerusalem. So one of the greatest discoveries, I think, of the last century was the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran scrolls, because so much of that verified what we have in the Bible, the passages of Isaiah primarily, a lot of them, and other ones. So what do we have with that, with those fragments that tell us that was true?
Yeah, one of the big ones when you talk to somebody, especially somebody that's Jewish, and you start talking to them about Isaiah, where it talks about the virgin giving birth, what you will get almost immediately, and also from atheists as well, you'll get the idea that this word that the Jewish people use is what was written in the book, the word that they use, and I'm losing track of the word, but all it meant was young woman. It didn't mean, supposedly didn't mean virgin. So that's their problem, and whatever they used in Isaiah back then, whether that was the original one or whether it got changed after that, I don't know. But probably in Isaiah's time, though, when you said young woman, you're not talking about somebody that wasn't married. A maiden. Yeah. You're not talking about somebody that's married, because that was a different word for it. But after that, and I just learned this maybe 3 or 4 years ago, the fact that the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint version was a version that was the Hebrew translated into the Greek. And there were 70 Jewish scholars that did this translation. And when they translated it into Greek, and this is Septuagint version of that particular passage, they used the word virgin, the Greek word of virgin. So there's 70 Jewish scholars that knew exactly what Isaiah talking about a virgin birth was talking about. Because if you take the whole context of it, God says, behold, I'm going to give you a sign. The Amma, I think is the word we're trying to use, is going to have a child. Now, you can take two different things. It's a young woman, and God saying, wow, this is an amazing thing. Wait for this. A young woman's going to give birth.
Wonder if that's ever happened
Wow, that's
before.
maybe 150 times a day. Which one you talking about, God? On the other hand, if he says a virgin's going to give birth, okay, now this is something that is unheard of. No virgins give birth. So that's one of the topics that I hear a lot of complaint about, especially if you're witnessing to anybody who's Jewish. They try to say, well, that doesn't appear in the Masoretic text. This is getting kind of deep, but the Masoretic text is a Jewish document that a lot of the Old Testament is written from. The Masoretic text is something in 1000 AD. It's something that the Jewish people wrote at that point. Now, we have to take some blame for this, because Jewish people don't like Christians very much. In the past, they haven't liked them. They're starting to warm up to us because they think we're the only friends they got. But in the past, they weren't all that thrilled about Christians, because Christians, the Crusades, were not such a great thing for the Jewish people. And the kings and the people that ruled Europe, they did not treat the Jewish people very well, and they called themselves Christians. So the Jewish people had a reason to not like us very much. So I can understand some of their complaints and some of the things that, when they hear someone, a Christian, talking to them, they say, well, you know something, the history with you guys haven't been very good. You came to the Crusades, you killed a bunch of our people, you tried to say that we killed Christ, and we called us Christ killers and all the rest of it. The Catholic Church said that the Jewish people were done with God, God was done with them. All this stuff that you said to us. And why should we listen to you? But some of those things, when you can start talking to them about documents such as the Septuagint version of the Bible, when they complain about the fact that there's a virgin birth mentioned, which is what happened, and there's not much argument even in the scrolls of the documents of the time in Jewish history. They don't say that she didn't have a virgin birth. They're trying to say that she was cheating, but she wasn't married. They don't argue over the fact that she wasn't married. They say she wasn't married and she had a kid. Now, they say that she committed adultery, but the fact is that she wasn't married. They do back that part up.
Now, one of the reasons I think that the archaeological part is important in this is I'm not a lawyer. That's Jay's job.
That's Jay's job, yeah.
I studied English. And one of the things that I know is that language changes over time. I mean, you think about our language and how it's changed so much. If we say gay, that just used to mean you were happy. Now it means something very different.
Very different, yeah.
If you said I'm gonna jet over here, that would just mean you were gonna go fast instead of take a plane somewhere. So our language has changed, and the meaning of words has changed. And that's what happens over the course of time, is that the interpretation of some things can change. But when you go back in the archaeology and you go back into the original documents and texts as much as we can get, and it supports what the interpretation is now of it. I think that's something very important, like looking at the Septuagint and saying, yeah, this is what they said it was. So they were the experts closest to the time, so they must be right. Instead of what we're doing now, which is 3,000 years removed from the prophecy. How can we be accurate with our language in that when the guys that were just 1,000 years removed are saying, here's what it means.
And what my point was with maybe the Masoretic text being altered in favor of not Christian involving Christianity. A bit of that you could understand because, like I said, we weren't treating him very well. And when they wrote the Masoretic text, they brought in this idea of Christianity, and they didn't like that because the Christians didn't treat them very well. And maybe the Masoretic text, the one we take it from, was altered. They made stuff up, and there's other instances of this as well, where they were trying to alter things so that it better aligned with Judaism as opposed to Christianity. Now, I love the Jewish people. I love them. I think all you guys do as well. But there's that little barrier there that when you come to talk to them about things and you talk about a virgin birth in Christ, they're probably not going to be very open to that right off the bat.
Well, I think I agree with that there was a lot of hostility because of the way they were treated. And I think too, if you look at it, even in the 1st and 2nd century where the church was largely Jewish, then it became mostly Gentile. How many good Jewish boys and girls were leaving their parents' faith to go with this new cult called Christianity? And that might have been some reaction to that, even that early, that, we have to do something to stop our kids from leaving what we're believing.
And Jesus talked about that I think it's in Matthew, where it talks about the fact that, you have to follow me. And this is going to split up your family. 3 are going to be against you, 2 are going to be for you. And Jesus is giving you facts. He's not saying that he likes it. He's just giving you the facts. The facts are that if you turn to Christianity at that point and going forward, then your family's not going to like you very much, because what you're doing is you're replacing Yahweh with this Jesus person. And that's what that's what their thoughts were. And they weren't looking at Messiah, where Daniel said Messiah was going to be an eternal figure. That's how he described him. But they weren't allowing that in. So when that comes around, there's that kind of built up problem. Whereas, like Jesus said, 3 are going to be against you, 2 are going to be for you. So, but don't let that bother you, is what he's trying to say, because that's the way it's going to be.
Yeah, but anytime that happens, there's reactions in the community, and I think that's where that probably did start from. But language is important, but that's why I think the archaeological part that we're looking at now is so important to it, because it goes back and it points out that these original things were correct. They were what they said they were. The stories were as they were presented. And we have evidence to back that up, meaning that then the Bible is true. And as you said, if they have evidence in these small things that it's true, then the big things must be true.
Right, you got a better idea, the fact that the whole story is accurate.
Yeah.
Whereas if the minor things are all goofy, let me give you an example, the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon, they talk about Jesus as well, but when you go back to the Book of Mormon and what Joseph Smith wrote, he wrote crazy stuff about South America. There was horses there when there were supposed to be horses, when the horses didn't arrive there for another 1,000 years. The continent was shaped improperly. All this stuff with the Book of Mormon, it's got all kinds of problems with it in actual physical pictures, like what we see in archaeology.
My favorite one of that, though, is when he said that the American Indians, the Native Americans, were the lost 10 tribes.
Oh, yeah.
But DNA-wise, they couldn't be further apart.
Yeah.
They're on the DNA scale, they're on opposite ends of it, so it's not even close to, like my family is largely from Holland area, but there's German, there's Danish, there's Swedish, all of that is kind of mixed and it's really close, the DNA. But between the Native Americans and Israel, that's about as far apart as you can get, and yet Joseph Smith was saying, oh no, those are the lost 10 tribes.
See, when I first came to faith, if somebody would introduce me into Mormonism, I would have said, okay, well, you can tell me that the situation that I have is resolved because, my daughter's in heaven with Jesus. But if I would have started looking after that and saying, okay, is this stuff right? Is this stuff true? I'm open to it, that's fine, but is it right and is it true? If I would have went down the road with Mormonism, I would have probably lost faith, because as in the history, like we're talking about, the minor details, they don't have that. Matter of fact, they have things that are completely wrong, like Dirk just said. And then they talk about these huge wars that were in South America on horseback.
Horses?
That's just nonsense. The horses weren't there. They just simply weren't there. And they find no evidence of any of the wars, of the people that he tries to talk about being at war. They find no evidence for that whatsoever. That stuff would have been a problem for me.
Well, and that's one of
And
the
that's why we're not, I think that's the reason why we're not Mormons, because
and I think that part of the apologetics situation is that we are encouraged to read and research the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're told to do. Read and research it. You have other religions in the world, major ones, that say don't read it, because then you'll come across questions that can't be answered. And then you'll doubt, and that means you're not saved in this or whatever. So don't read it. Just believe that it's true.
if Kevin was around, he would say that's what Jehovah's Witnesses are all
Jehovah's
about.
Witnesses does that.
You're not supposed to look
Islam
in
does that.
don't look at the computer. It's got stuff on there that's lies.
Yeah,
Don't be researching stuff, because you're going to find out that none of it's true.
but we say look at it. Look at it, because the more you look at it, the more truth
The more
is
truth
there.
comes there. Exactly right. Well, you guys want questions? Anything that you heard that you got questions about? We're getting near going home, but
Ask Kelly, I don't know.
any questions that came up while we were discussing stuff?
Oh,
See?
So I would mention about the virgin birth, of just the importance of that. It's interesting that Larry King, the late CNN host, he said that if he could interview Jesus Christ, that the main question he would ask Jesus is, was he virgin born?
Yeah.
And back in the 1940s and 1950s, a little bit before most people today were alive, that was a big topic. And the lack of belief in the virgin birth had a lot to do with society embracing secular and liberal directions.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is a miracle. No question, it's a miracle. But you know something, when some of the people I talk to, they atheists say, well, you believe in miracles. They don't say out that way, but they'll mention things that, in the Bible, well, you got people talking to snakes, you got donkeys talking, you got all this stuff going on. Would you think you really believe that? And they'll say, well, it all depends on who's doing it, right? If I'm doing it, you shouldn't believe it. But if the person that created all things is doing it, maybe you should look at that a little bit.
My thing with miracles is that I think, they say don't believe in miracles, but you'll believe in evolution.
That's what I was going to
They
say.
came
You
from
believe in the biggest miracles that have ever
chemicals
been
on a rock?
preached. Yeah. Rain fell on a rock and all of a sudden we're here.
Yeah.
You believe in way bigger miracles than you can go from math. Jay will tell you, because he's been through all the probability classes in college. So you go to any math director and talk to them about what evolution is supposed to portray, they'll say the odds against it are prohibitive. They're absurd odds against it, because it's magical. It's nothing short of magical. So an atheist tells me that I believe in miracles, I say, well, yeah, sure I do, but so do you. You think that we got here from rain falling on a rock, or life just spontaneously appearing in front of someone, and there was no cause for it. Physics principle, the cause and effect, you deny that. You just think the effect just appeared. There was no cause for it. Me as a Christian, I have a cause for it.
Yeah, and on the other side of that coin, we have the predictions of the birth of Jesus, just dealing with that. The predictions of where he's going to be born, when it would happen, the events surrounding it, just those prophecies themselves, all coming true at the same time, the same person, outnumber the number of atoms in the universe.
Yeah.
And yet, it happened.
It happened.
And so we know that there had to be a guiding hand behind it. It just didn't occur. It just didn't happen out of nothing.
Yeah, there's a causal agent to it, and that's the one that created everything. Then I was told when I first came to faith, you can believe Genesis 1:1, the rest of it's easy. I said, okay, well, let me read Genesis 1 then. And yeah, and if you realize who's doing the miracles, then you have somebody that doesn't have a problem. He created everything we have. He created physics, how it works.
Yes.
If he decides that he's going to interrupt physics for a little while, That's
And
what
I
he'll
think
do.
actually, if you can believe the first 4 words, in the beginning,
In the
God,
beginning, God, yeah.
then everything else is easy.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So anybody else, any other questions? If not, then we'll tie it up. Gonna close this out?
I'll close this out.
All right.
Lord, we thank you for the privilege that we have to come here and study, Lord, to learn about how you have touched history, Lord, how you've put all of this in place and in motion, and how everything just fits together, Lord. But above all, how you came for us, how you came to sacrifice for us, to redeem us, to draw us into your kingdom. Be with us, Lord, as we go forward. May we be bold in our faith, may we be bold in speaking of you, and may our love for you just pour out from us to this lost and dying world. Guide us, keep us in your hands. We ask this in the name of Christ alone. Amen.
Amen.